This government has set out a net zero grid by 2035. They are two sort of, in effect, competing visions. There's a big difference between that 5-year sort of period in actually trying to deliver a net zero grid. But if we fail, ultimately, either it's the Conservative Party or the Labour Party to deliver this, you undermine trust in the transition. Recognising that the future of the net zero transition will predominantly be electrification. We're already beginning to see some of those debates that were still present in the net zero review slowly being closed now. And there's an important question about being agnostic around certain uses of technology and future role of hydrogen, but it's becoming increasingly clear that there is no role for hydrogen in domestic heating, and we've seen the failure of the heating trials. It seems to be leading down a route where we can be more certain about this for the future. But taking the decisions now that need to be taken, for instance, on rebalancing gas and electricity prices, difficult nettles to be grasped, is really important. And the challenge will be in this sort of final year, just at the moment where we need the transition to ramp up and to provide sort of certainty and security and stability in order to attract that inward investment, that we end up fighting battles over net zero being sort of too costly, and that somehow by delaying we're going to be saving people money. That is a false narrative. By delaying, we'll be making the transition more expensive. By delaying, we will be ensuring that the costs of the materials will rise, the cost of the labour will rise, and potentially some of the companies that would have invested in the UK will go elsewhere. So I'm here today, obviously, to make the case that we're going to seem to supercharge the transition. Yes, we've got to be able to set out a plan. Yes, there obviously is a question over how that plan is articulated, whether it's at a regional level or at a national level, and that's an important debate that we have around the nature of the grid and how we build out storage capability, capacity, and the future uses of technologies, hydrogen on the grid. That's important. We need the business models in place to be able to provide that certainty. But there is a wider question which we need in order for you as organisations, businesses and industry to make the case both to government and the public. Going slow is not an option. Going slow will only cost more. Going slow will only ensure the UK falls further behind. And ultimately, it will be householders and their bills that will suffer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Alexander, over to you.
Thank you. It's always I wouldn't say a pleasure to follow Chris. It's awful following Chris. Chris is an expert in the field and basically steals all my stuff. So he said everything I wanted to say. But I say that half jest. Chris is right in so many ways. There's going to be a part of Chris. So many ways about the transition. We need to do more. We need to go farther and farther. I remember when I came to conference a couple of years ago, I was quite proud of what the UK were doing in the hydrogen sector. I put up Michelle, quite interested in hydrogen, chaired the all-party group in hydrogen. We were the world leader in hydrogen. We were leading the way in the world. I can't say that anymore. I can't say that when it comes to hydrogen anymore, that we have been left behind. Germany's investment, the IRA in America, we are losing the battle. I do disagree with Chris, though, on hydrogen. Chris saying there's no place for hydrogen and home heating. I actually think there's a central place for hydrogen and home heating, because heat pumps are not going to be the answer for everything, nor heat distribution networks. When you live in terrace homes, we live in flats, hydrogen may not be the answer, but we don't know what the answer is for those people who cannot use heat pumps. And I think there's going to be about 6 million people who will not be able to have heat pumps in their home. So we need to decarbonise them. We need to decarbonise everyone. And I think hydrogen at the moment seems to be the only solution. Yes, there are difficulties around the production of hydrogen, how done it, but we need to be trying everything. And we need to be quite happy with the failures. And the Whitby trial failed, but there's other trials going on in Scotland which seem to be more successful. So I think we have to be quite open to be failing. And I think one of the problems government has as a whole is that we are scared of failure. We're scared of, dare I say, wasting inverted commas taxpayers' money, because you have a trial, it fails. It's called a failure. It's a waste of how many millions of pounds put into it, which we say, yes, during this transition, there are going to be a lot of failures. We're going to lose a lot of money. We've got to accept that. But the only way of getting that transition and reaching our net zero targets is by trying a lot of different things, being quite happy with failure going. And I always use the analysis of the comparison to the vaccine rollout, which was very successful in the UK. We backed lots of different types of vaccines, knowing that some of them wouldn't work. We put a lot of money on a lot of vaccines, but because we backed a whole range of them, we managed to get a good vaccine rollout because one of those did come up trumps. And when it comes to net zero, it's not a question, oh, do you want to back the winner or wait? We have to achieve net zero. It's good for the country, good for the planet. We need it. We can't wait. We have to be accepting that we're going to lose money on trials and stuff, and we need to go forward. But one thing I think has changed over the last even couple of weeks is some of the language and some of the thinking behind net zero. And I know Chris and I will slightly disagree on this. I actually fully support the Prime Minister changing the target to 2035. And I think it's actually quite good that the Prime Minister is having an open, honest conversation about transition. Because too often we talk about transition, talk about how it's essential that we transition, but we don't actually think about the costs. And I don't necessarily mean for the money costs, but the costs on people's lives and impact, and things you don't normally think about. Like, I'm going to use a very parochial example. For the village I live in, Part Hill in South Yorkshire, it's a village of 800 people, small village, 3 entrance exits to the village. We've got the Woodall M1 services 2 miles away, 1.5 miles away, and they're putting in rapid chargers. They're pushing a few rapid chargers at motorway service stations. They're closing at the moment 2 entrance exits to the village for 11 weeks to run the cables through the village. That's just to put a few rapid chargers in a service station, which is no benefit to the village, and the village is up in arms, newspaper reports, BBC, all that sort of stuff. And that's a very small part of the transition. So I think people haven't really appreciated how damaging, stressful the transition is going to be. And we need to have that open conversation. I think with the Prime Minister pushing back the 2030 to 35 targets for EVs, actually acknowledges that it's not going to be easy. I think too many people in this room have talked about net zero in the abstract, how important it is, without realizing the sort of human impacts of it. So we're last having this sort of cost. And I think when it comes to the 2030 target, it seems that they constantly, sector states came about the last few years, new sector states wanted us a press release to slice a couple of years off when they need to go to net zero for cars. We're now actually saying, actually, we need to think about how realistic those targets are. Because I'd rather us change the target 7 years out, which we have done, than changing the target 2 years out, 1 year out, when we're not going to achieve it. And I think you can only put targets if they're going to be achievable and reached. And I know some of you may argue that actually you need really tough targets that will force the transition quicker. But my argument would also be, if we scare the horses or do such a hard transition, that will turn people off and damage people. And that is where we need to bring people along with us. We need to be world leaders, but we also need to bring people along with us. And I fear sometimes we go a bit too hard without thinking about the human cost. I think I'll ask the government's exception.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Lots of food for thought there. Catherine, we turn to you next.
Well, similarly, I think we're all going to be saying many of the same points here. But first of all, I come from a company called SSE. So we are trying to position ourselves as a company that will lead the energy transition. You know, we've committed to shareholders that we want to spend £40 billion over the next decade in order to get the UK and Ireland into ultimately the net zero state that it is targeting. The decarbonisation of the power system by 2035. What will that take? It will take building more offshore wind. It will take transforming the UK electricity grid. So we run the grids up in Scotland. We've got distribution networks down in the south. And then it'll involve pioneering flexible technologies that are risky, that no one does understand the true economics of, and they don't understand necessarily what the role it is going to play within the system as a whole. But unless you actually build these projects and start to implement them, we will never understand. So those are the commitments that we've made to our shareholders. But in order to do that, you effectively have to be able to, 1, get a reasonable return, 2, have mechanisms through which you can achieve a reasonable return, and 3, have certainty over the timeline in order to ensure what that reasonable return ends up. What is your NPV? What is your IRR on those projects? Now, at the moment, those 3 are lacking. And so in terms of ambition and implementation, there is a gap. We have targets, we have the beginnings of policies, but we don't have implementation. So when you look at the industrial cluster process, we've been part of that process since 2019. And what we've seen is that it slips 6 months by 6 months by 6 months. We have to go back to the board and say we need to spend another 5 million, another 10 million, another 20 million in order to be part of a process that if you're not part of the process, there's no way that you can actually consider it. And so the challenge you have is, at what point can you continue to justify that level of DevEx when you have no clarity on implementation? And a good example, so since 2019, not a single CCS project has gone into implementation, has taken FID, and they're now pushed out to September next year, the earliest it'll be. That is only one power CCS project. Now, our estimates are you need at least 9 gigawatts of power CCS. On top of that, you need extra flexibility coming through from hydrogen, from batteries. All of these technologies are going to be required. And what we're not able to do is implement them fast enough to deliver the 2035 decarbonisation target. If you think planning now takes you 3 to 4 years, if you think about the technological challenges, the first of a kind risk, just practically, you're working back from 2035 to today, and you're beginning to see we're already at risk. And whether it's this government, whether it's another government, 2035 is a risk level at 2030. So for us, I think the key things to really focus on now are implementation. Now, risk versus cost is a good discussion. So you can spend more earlier to reduce cost overall and reduce risk. So it's about implementation of those first pioneering projects that will really reduce the overall cost of the system. It's about system planning. So to your point, Chris, about actually stepping back and saying, what are the long-term key decisions that needs to be made? What is required where? How will the necessary infrastructure be developed in parallel and in tandem in order to meet the timelines? And then will the grid connections be there when you need them? And then finally, market reform, whether it's REMA, whether it's capacity mechanisms, how do they all link into the other three? And so those are the things where you have to look at it in the round. And I think we're getting there. I think we're having some good conversations about it, but that'll be key for the future of delivering decarbonised power.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And then last but not least, Steve, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, as usual, everybody else has said everything I want to say, so that's fine. I was asked to consider some of the technological barriers in terms of what prevents us moving forward. Some of you may know, so Siemens Energy is responsible for roughly 1/6 of the world generating capacity, so we've got a good place to start from. I'm probably a bit biased, but I don't believe technology is going to be the constraining factor, if I'm honest. I think it's probably going to be legislation, regulation, policies, business models. I have to mention transport and storage because Chris is in the audience. We made a good start toward net zero, but I think it would be a real tragedy if we drop the baton now. So that's a concern I have. I think there's no doubt from a UK perspective, we need to increase the pace and the scale of what we have to do in the deployment of clean tech. I think that gives clarity for developers, it gives clarity for suppliers, investors, and critically supply chains that are starting off on nascent technologies. So if we're not careful, we lose supply chains externally to the UK, which is something we need to be careful of. I don't think it's helpful when we get dates changing or moving goalposts or refuse to accept some real big fundamental changes that happen that create uncertainty. And it risks the UK taking its rightful place in the domestic and international market. So I think that's something we need to be very careful of. I think another thing I'm really concerned about is net zero is becoming a partisan issue. And it's been the dividing thing between Conservatives and Labour. I think with all of this, it needs to span multi-parliaments, it's got to be multi-generations, etc. It is the growth opportunity of the 21st century. It's an opportunity for a generation, 4 generations. And I think even in my career, I think climate change has really become front and central of mainstream consciousness. So I'd like to think that we can embrace that. I think we should be really proud of what has been achieved in moving to renewables and the elimination of coal. But we cannot rest on our laurels and stand behind the popular strapline that we have 4 of the largest wind farms in the world. Actually, I did hear this one, somebody mentioned there's a 5th in the pipeline as well. But we need to be careful about that. During a recent visit I had to our wind turbine facility in Hull, I was reminded of the art of the possible, the sheer scale of offshore wind technology made possible by the capabilities of very highly skilled people that are making these blades. We've made over 2,000 blades in our facility as well, which started from 0. And these are now being pumped out 108 meters long. It just gives you a feel for 50 tons of weight each. But then there is a big but. I guess our crown is slipping. The disastrous AR5 round, when no new offshore wind projects were successful, shows the scale of the challenge. But it wasn't unexpected, but it was allowed to happen. which concerns me. We need offshore wind to reach net zero, but the industry is struggling. To meet the 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, which has already been mentioned by Chris, by 2030, we need to build about 3 times as much in about a third of the time it's taken to build what we have so far. And I think ER5 shows that the policy and the practicalities are just not adding up to the changes that are in the market. The CFD allocation mechanism needs to be reformed to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And I'm hopeful that the government are working on that as we speak. If we achieve our targets en route to net zero, whole new industries will have to ramp up and deliver at scale. If we use electrolytic hydrogen, for example, in Great Britain, we've got to grow that in the order of 10,000 times of where it is today. And by the end of the decade. And to put that into context, that's like asking the hydrogen industry to expand to the size of today's electricity industry in less than 10 years. In that, it took the electricity sector almost a century to do that. To just put the size of the scale that needs to be done. And while the UK spends time developing a complex support model for hydrogen, neighbouring countries have been proceeding to build projects. We are yet to award anything in the UK over 5 megawatts, whilst the scale of green hydrogen projects has now been around 100 megawatts. So the scale is going higher around the world. And electrolyzer manufacturers have announced gigafactories in Europe, 6 are in Germany, and the UK's only manufacturer has scaled down plans for their plans here in the UK. We have a little strapline. There is no energy transition without transmission, and our electricity grid must be fit for purpose for to deliver net zero. Our network comprises the veins and arteries that transfer power from offshore to onshore and cross-border. Just last month, Nick Windsor's eagerly awaited report highlighted how new power lines could be built in half the time, down from 40 years to 7 years, and we need to ensure his recommendations are adopted in full to enable this once-in-a-generation opportunity to become a reality. To supercharge clean energy industries or clean energy transition, we need to make the UK the place to do green business. Short-term, that's accelerating project initiation. And the Chancellor will tell you that you can't compete on subsidies with the IRA or with the European Green Deal. So how can we make the UK the easiest place to do business and more effective? But I think long-term, this means a pragmatic, refreshed approach of regulation across both Britain and the developed nations that enables us to realise new projects and grow capacity so that we can keep on delivering and not fall behind. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all our panelists. I've got a couple of questions for the 4 of you, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. Firstly for you, Alexander, actually, we heard there from Steve and from Catherine about the sheer scale of the technologies and bottlenecks that we need to confront. And you yourself said that we're going to have to place lots of different bets to solve those, and if we have any chance of succeeding. But that does mean changing our political culture, right? Because I spoke at a select committee and was asked by an MP. So you're telling me that we have to go back to our constituents and say, we wasted your money? And the answer to that is yes, right? But how do we change that?
And I think that's what I'm trying to get at about what's the supporting officer, the Prime Minister's recent announcement. We have to have that honest conversation, and we're not. I think in some ways, in the last couple of years, we've almost sold the land of milk and honey to our constituents, saying, the energy transition will have lots of wonderful new green jobs. Yes, some more old jobs go, but so many more will be created. It'll be great. And already my constituents turning around saying, we don't believe it. Where are all these green jobs promised? We in this room appreciate it's a 10-year plus process to get these new green jobs. They're going to get there eventually, but the public doesn't sort of see that. Likewise, when it comes to the various rollouts or the banning of cars, we need to have that conversation. And I don't believe we've actually been honest as policymakers by industry, by media. It is going to be tough. It is going to be slow. It's the right thing to do. You're going to have the benefits, and we need to spend money. But in the long term, it will be good. But if you're asking me, how can you stop, political parties on the other side making opportunism, that is going to be hard. Or media or business say, well, actually, waste money. That is a problem I think we have with our democracy at all. We are do think of sort of a few year cycles rather than it's even, and that's for whole policy though, isn't it? I've heard recently my in-laws who work in the NHS, some of the stuff going on which the government's announced, their hospitals, they're not going to implement because, in the manager's words, they might have been government next year, so no point working on this. We need to get the culture that we are going to work on together. And generally, there is some division between us and Labour, obviously, on scale, but Labour wants to move forward. There's no, or very little, climate skepticism anymore when it comes to actually climate change. The skepticism, I feel, is where is the speed and the pace. So we just need to have a few more honest conversations about how to solve politics and politicians.
And Chris, one for you. Liz Truss and Priti Patel had a growth rally this morning, and their catchphrase was, "We need to stop taxing and banning things and start producing and building things." I think when Rishi Sunak made his announcements, I think there was quite a negative reaction to that kind of tone from people like Ford, from Make UK, from the CBI. Who's right?
Well, I have to thank Liz because I think she commissioned the net zero review, and I always say it's a bit like a rare Edward VIII coin. It was probably the one thing that came out of her premiership that sort of survived, that actually sort of delivered something. Everything else got sort of cancelled and chucked in the policy bit. So hopefully Liz will recognise her legacy in the Mission Zero report. And obviously, you might remember I wrote a rather controversial book called Britannia Unchained with Liz about 10 years ago, or something, back in 2012. I didn't write the Britain's Idol bit; that was a different author. But I wrote a chapter on Israel and really sort of promoting the future economy around research and development and how we should identify, effectively what was happening in this global race. Economies are shifting, regardless of what we think sort of politically in Britain, and where we find Britain's role in these future economies. It's no different with net zero, and it doesn't matter what Priti Patel or Liz Truss does. Actually, politicians are becoming increasingly irrelevant to the fact that global net zero markets are emerging. As I'm having this conversation now with you, there are decisions being made in boardrooms about where to place future investment. I'm afraid to say, the Prime Minister's tone, and it was the tone, not the policy, because to misquote Theresa May, nothing has changed. When you look at the ZEV mandate, we're going to be voting for the same ZEV mandate that was set out in the consultation back in March. I'm not sure whether my colleagues in the Net Zero Scrutiny Group know this yet, but nothing has changed. We already set out in the Net Zero strategy that we would have no new petrol vehicle, diesel cars from 2030 with exceptions, and all they've done now is sort of create exceptions being 20%. It's the same with gas boilers. It was always the case that it was to move from boilers, and no one was ever saying that we would ask you to scrap your boiler. It's simply that once your boiler packed up and packed in, you would move on to a heat pump. No one's ever saying, we're going to make you pay £15,000 to do this, because you have to pay anyway to replace your gas boiler. So instead of like with like, you're moving to a new system, by which time, as the heat and building strategy very clearly sets out, heat pumps would be cheaper than gas boilers. It would be a government commitment to make sure that was the case. Actually, it's fundamentally dishonest. If you're talking about honesty, to tell the public there has been a policy shift when all that's happened is they just identified the exceptions as being 20% in EVs and 20% when it comes to clean heat mechanisms for the future. Nothing has changed. And ultimately, we're in the run-up to a general election by which we're trying to play party politics at a time where we should have cross-party consensus on delivering on climate, just in the same way the Climate Act was passed in 2008, was backed not just by the Conservative Party, but we urged Labour to go further to increase their emissions reduction from 60% to 80%. We are at risk of losing this consensus. And it is so important for the countries to recognise we can do this cross-party, because regardless of what happens the next general election, net zero to 2050, we'll see several administrations coming in, regardless of whatever political colour they represent. And we have a responsibility to citizens to make sure we deliver this transition and not try to create rhetoric on the back of it. Nothing has changed in terms of the policy, and we should be honest with that. What has changed is the tone, and the tone has now meant that there are investors who are less certain about internationally putting their money in the UK and will instead go to the US, will instead go to Germany, will instead go to France, where Macron announced a 1 million heat pump target, a certain outcome that they're going to work towards. And that's the risk that we face. That's the policy risk that we're going to face by going slow, because it isn't about cost. No one has ever said to householders, if you read the net zero strategy, it says no one will be forced to sell their petrol car, no one will be forced to rip out their boiler. That was always the case. This is just the transition like any other transition. Just in the same way we had, back in 2011, 11% of people had smart TVs. Most people didn't own them because they were far too expensive. They cost like £5,000. Now they're down at £500. We've got over 80% of the population own a smart TV. The climate transition is exceptional because of the nature of the crisis we face, but it actually isn't exceptional when it comes to some of the measures that we need. And there is no such thing as inexpensive insulation measures. We're not expecting everyone to do energy strong and to totally retrofit their house. All we are asking is for £500 worth of insulation material to be put in their roof, given that we have 30% more properties with no loft insulation. That is the reality by which we've got the responsibility of government to create the policy mechanisms to deliver on this. But we shouldn't go around telling people that this is costly, and as a result, by delaying, that we're going to make it cheaper for them, because actually the opposite is the case. The more that we delay, the more expensive it will be for households. And that's the reality of net zero and the transition, particularly around minimum energy efficiency standards. Delaying this is going to cost £8 billion over 10 years in additional energy prices as a result of keeping people disproportionately on high gas prices. 80% of our heating is gas compared to 50% in Europe. We're the poor man of Europe when it comes to looking at energy efficiency. If you take a house in the UK and you heat it up to 20 degrees, and over 5 hours it loses 3 degrees of heat compared to 0.3 degrees in Sweden. That's the reality. And actually reducing energy demand is the cheapest way we can deliver also for the grid and providing extra support for our future net zero grid. This isn't rocket science, but we shouldn't also mislead householders about the consequences. You've all spoken about the trade-offs and what's needed. The net zero review was very clear about the trade-offs and what's needed and the cost, and where we ensure the taxpayer must pay, but also private finance and investment must pay. But let's not try to change the terms of the debate when there really shouldn't be a debate amongst us about what is needed.
Thank you, Chris. Maybe the only room at this conference where a joke about energy strong get behind it. So, we were very worried as well about the announcements that what was damaging was not the actual detail of the policy, but rolling back on the political consensus. So many people have said in the past that the UK's consensus is our superpower here. Other countries haven't been able to go or have gone further, like with the Inflation Reduction Act, but have not been able to do some things like legislation and regulation because they have lacked that consensus. But I'm going to ask now about Catherine and Steve, a question for the two of you. We've heard a little bit about Next Gen EU, about the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm sure lots of people will also be concerned about this kind of like the concept here that the train is leaving the station for the UK now. We need to see ambition if we're going to capture a benefit. Or, as Chris said, those investment decisions are happening every day. I'd really like to hear from the two of you from like a business and commercial perspective. Is that right? What is your view on Next Gen EU and IRA, and what's the sort of timescale here that we're talking about?
Well, I'll start. So with the exception of Siemens Energy, who are obviously our favourite OEM, I've caveated it. The biggest challenge we've got is getting any commitment in the supply chain, because what there has, the experience of the OEMs that we are using, so if you think about the business that I run, it's gas power stations, gas storage, but aiming to decarbonize. So for 4 years now, we've been looking at, well, actually SSE for 20 years has been looking at carbon capture and storage. But 4 years, we've seriously been embarking on engineering and design studies in order to position at least 2 of our assets for Power CCS. We've been looking at hydrogen storage. We've got a project into the HAR1 process looking at electrolyzer storage and power, hydrogen to power. We've got multiple projects, all of which are going through engineering and design stages. And what we can't do is commit. Suddenly we get a delay in the timeline, and then we say, okay, well, we said we were going to do this, but can you just hold back a bit, and we'll just trickle the money out. In that same, just the last 18 months, what you've got is projects that have gone from concept up to feed to then FID in the US. And then you've now got that. And so when we go to the OEMs, when we go to the integrators and we say, will you commit a team, will you give us your A team and do this study for us? Their reaction is, well, it's never going to cross the line, so we've got to go somewhere else. So we've seen ourselves slip down the priority queue, whether it's for CCS technology, whether it's for storage engineers, which are very few and far between for salt cavern storage. We've seen them go to the US, we've seen them go to the Intermountain project in Utah, because that's happening. Chevron's just invested in it. These are big projects with big names, and money is being spent. And guess what? Little SSE gets left behind. So these are the real challenges that we've just experienced in the last 18 months as a result of that constant slipping of process.
It's really concerning.
Apart from Siemens Energy, that's the whole way.
She's into every pump. I think we've experienced exactly what you described, Chris. I think you've got to bear in mind that I'm trying to compete with 93 other countries that have got one of me in their country, trying to attract attention and investment in their country. And I think we've had a sequence of events. We've had Brexit, we've had Liz Truss, we've had, hydrogen policy, Kwasi Kwarteng was in one of these rooms, Robinson, 200 megawatts of green hydrogen production. Here we are 3 years later, and we still haven't got anywhere near that. And we march our boards up to the top of the hill, and then we actually have to march them back down again, which you lose confidence. No doubt about it, the UK is a very, very important market for us, especially with the commitments on net zero, etc. But I would just, one of the words I said the other day was be cautious on some of the narrative that you use about being controlled and measured. People can interpret that it's sliding back from net zero. I am refreshed to hear that we're not. It's mainly around the EV vehicles and things like that. But I just think actions speak a lot louder than words when you're trying to convince boards to do this.
Great, thanks, Steve. All right, time for audience questions. Chris has to head off about 15 minutes early at 4:45 to go and give another rabble-rousing speech to another event on the Fringe, and he'll just do. But I can't remember what order they came up in. We have microphones, I think. One here on the front, this gentleman on the aisle, and then the gentleman behind him.
Thank you, Nick from Virgin Atlantic. Just thinking about what Alexander and Chris both said about the sort of the process problems and sort of the fear element of it and the fear of sort of failure. I wonder if you've got any comment regarding the constant cycle of consultation that the government seems to be stuck in at the moment in terms of the way things happen. So I particularly think about sustainable aviation fuels and how we've gone through a cycle of industry with basically a united voice saying we need a price support mechanism, we need this now in order to meet the government's own ambitious targets of 5 SAF plants by 2025. Chris, I know you said that in your review, you talked about a CFD star scheme, and we've gone back through a whole review of that, a consultation again and again and again. And it just seems we're constantly stuck on this sort of merry-go-round of consultation. So how do we break that in order to move a bit more like the Americans have done with the Inflation Reduction Act, or other countries that are moving faster?
Thank you. Great question. And then this gentleman here.
Thanks very much, Angus Hill from WA Communications. I guess regardless of whether we are or not slipping back on the energy transition, going back to the title of the event about supercharging, if there was one intervention or policy action that could be taken for each of you, what would that one thing be?
Okay, and then the gentleman behind you.
Just on my question, Chris Manton-Wynn from Progressive Energy. Yeah, it is. We have a real opportunity, whether it's our electricity grid to decarbonize, whether it's our industrials, rather than deindustrialize, we can bring new companies here. What is that intervention that this administration could look back on that has made a difference on our journey to net zero, so that we don't have the hiatus that Alexander talked about, or the delay that Chris talked about?
Great, thank you. And next round, I'd love to take some questions from women. So get your thinking hats on. Who wants to take those questions first? Cycle of consultations.
One shot. Cycle of consultation, yes, it's far too long. We should be getting on with it. And what we do policy, just turn every single penny we've got at hydrogen and development of hydrogen, because the whole world will be needing hydrogen. And we need to produce as much as possible. We need to develop the mechanism possible so we can sell it as quickly as possible. And that's the best thing. Every single penny we've invested should be chucked at hydrogen, because frankly, every other technology we've lost and we're not going to make money out of. And we are, but I'm a conservative. Hopefully some conservative audience as well. We're also making money out of the energy transition as well. And net zero, I think hydrogen is at the moment, maybe sustainable aviation fuel is the only way left where we can actually make serious money for our economy as well.
Steve, just give me the facial expression of a man with one idea. Solve this thing.
I think on the consultation thing, we just listened to the Chancellor before. He's talking about simplifying things like that. I think absolutely, if it was business, you would get it rid of it, you would fix it. So I would say civil servants need to sort of, because I do think civil servants actually keep a handle on some of these processes, so you can reduce those. I would probably build on the hydrogen piece, and I'll say transportation and storage, because the scale and the volume of what we're talking about, whether that's CO2, whether that's hydrogen, whatever it might be, I would put transport and storage.
Yeah, I mean, on the consultation point, in terms of obviously how we get away from individual governments just making announcements, and it's the same with nuclear. The last thing the industry wanted was another competition and consultation. That's what they got. We needed an investment decision. So it's almost like, how do you create those vehicles where you sort of say this will be the pipeline? I think it's a way of allying that with the Treasury investment decisions, having more dynamic investing decisions outside the spending review that would sort of set out this is what's going to happen. There is that tension between short-term urgency and long-term stability, and how you get that right, because obviously you don't want to decide in haste and repent, in leisure. So like, how do we ensure that we make decisions that we can stick to in the long term as well? So yeah, it's a real challenge, but it does require, I think, sort of a better sense of leadership from whoever is in government to sort of set out a process. And then probably my choice is going to be one around planning, I think, and permitting. We mentioned the Windsor Review. Over half of all decisions on net zero are not in the control of this government. What the government can do is to create the framework by which then others can take the decisions, and that's the key challenge. Is the sooner we can make sure that regional and local authorities have the policy tools, the planning tools that work for net zero and not against net zero is really critical, which is why the consultation on the IPPR, to go back full circle to another consultation, is so important to get that right.
It's good being last, everyone's already said it. So on consultations, coordinations, consultations, so the number of consultations we've had on almost exactly the same thing between different parts of even the same department. So one doing energy security, another one doing net zero, and they consult on the same thing. It's frustrating. So I don't mind being consulted, but only asking once. So that's point one. And point two on, we've already had transport and storage, we've already had planning. So those would have been 1 and 2. So number 3 would be linked to the spatial plan that was announced, is effectively linking up the future systems operator with strategic national infrastructure that then goes into planning and transport and storage business models that effectively allows you to say, we need this here, we need it by then, and therefore now we go through with it based on legislation. If we put that all together, then we might just get it done in time.
Great. Let's see if we can take another round of 3. One question here, a gentleman behind you and a man with a pink shirt on the aisle. First of all, lady on the front row.
Thanks. I'm Miranda Barker from Chief Executive East Lancs Chamber of Commerce and an innovation agency for low carbon tech called Red Cat. Completely agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think the optics of the recent announcement feels like when they yanked the feed-in tariffs away from solar and completely destabilized the public's belief in the industry. Nothing changed except for the public's belief in the industry. She's hugely important. How do we get government to change their minds about this being an opportunity, a huge economic opportunity for the UK technologies to actually really take the grasp of this global market and move forward with that? And also, how do we get them to put the investment into the grid we need so that isn't constraining our development of low carbon tech?
Great, thank you. And then the gentleman behind you.
Hello, David Adams here from the UK Green Building Council. Accept policies have to change, yeah, but the narrative around them is incredibly important. Otherwise, there's enormous amounts of damage done, especially in a track record of reversals. I mean, if we, from a homes perspective, zero carbon homes scrapped a year before it was to be implemented after 9 years of prep. Green prep collapsed an entire industry again. I was there with Knauf having to have those conversations. They have long memories, they don't turn over. They're the same family. It's really, really hard to get investment. So on the basis that homes is important, new or existing, cost of living, health, energy demand, peak energy particularly, we have to do something. The panel question is, with to nudge behaviours, grants or taxes, on the basis that the grants, great, they've increased the heat pumps. I'm glad I'm not a heat pump manufacturer. I've collapsed too many insulation companies when the grants come to an end. So these things really need designing well, but which is better?
Great. And then the gentleman on the aisle with the pink shirt.
Jonathan Lee, kind of the energy editor at the Daily Telegraph. And I just wanted to look at the contrast between the long-term issues involved in energy and energy infrastructure and the very short-term nature of the politics and what politicians want in the context of the coming general election and the politicisation of net zero. And it's kind of happened quite quickly. So we had Nick Timothy writing today about the monomaniacal obsession of the Climate Change Committee, which is really quite a neutral body. And this is just the beginning. So in the coming year or so, what message would you have for politicians in the very short-term battle for power in the context of the long-term damage they could do to the energy industry?
Great question. So there's a specific one there on the policy, grants versus taxes, fun question. And then a kind of wider one again on the returning back to that politics question. What's the long-term versus short-term argument we need to make, and who and how do we convince the government we need to change? I'll start at this end of the table.
Grants or taxes, both. I think we start with incentives and then you bring in the stick. So you have to create a bottom-up solution, and you do that through incentives, and then you scale it up through the stick by forcing people to adopt a new technology. But if you don't have the foundation to scale up, there's no point then putting in a stick, because there's just a gap. All you create is a gap. So that's the answer to that question. In terms of sort of both of those questions, it's interesting only because I've watched the political rhetoric change. There's someone that lived in North America and went through the Trump administration and then the Biden administration. So I came back in 21. What's interesting is we seem to not be looking for what the common ground is. The common ground is energy security. The common ground is levelling up. The common ground is needing to find something that's going to grow the UK's GDP, because if it is an energy transition, I don't know what it is. And I struggle with why we don't focus on the common ground that the energy transition can provide us, and we choose what separates us, which is this climate change left versus right, or ideological battle as to what the solution is. And so for me, the way to solve this is for more sensible people to talk about the common ground versus the non-sensible people talking about what separates us. And I don't know how you get people to invest in the grid other than ultimately to illustrate and set up. And I think Ofgem doing this quite well, the structures through which companies can invest in the grid. So we've got ASTI and transmission, we're looking at the same coming through with distribution, and we need to know what the next generation of those projects are going to be.
I think on taxation, the incentives must be aligned in a way that sort of works with the user, the customer, the household, or how it filters into their sort of ambitions, their dreams. So you can have a sort of technocratic approach to delivering the transition, but we've got to think through the behavioural sort of challenges, not to sort of force people to take decisions, but how they can make decisions that they themselves see as being ones that are going to make themselves richer and warmer, and not colder and poorer, and actually how we can incentivize energy saving stamp duty mechanisms, as well as also landlords. Let's just make sure they can take this off their tax bill. Really simple things. So you involve the tax system, but obviously doing the work that realizes that people are going to be better off making this transition. I think the challenge, you mentioned Nick Timothy, is, and obviously this is one that affects the media as much as politics around, is how do we have a genuine debate where those who are willing to have a discussion around costs and consequences and trade-offs, and are willing to do so on an evidence-based process, aren't necessarily placed as in an equal situation as those who are effectively demagogues, who are simply taking a populist sort of narrative without any evidence-based approach. ultimately, the Committee on Climate Change is an independent advisory body created by legislation. They have no right to fight back. They don't create any policies. All they do is report on the policies that have been created by government. And we are in a deeply dangerous and divisive place if elected officials, and Nick Timothy is not elected yet, but he's potentially going to be taken from Matt Hancock, are challenging those civil servants, and those policy specialists have no right to answer back. And I think that the challenge is, someone like Nick Timothy, who nearly sank the Tory party in 2017 with his manifesto, what rights does he have to be able to comment on what is electorally successful when he's already proven he's unable to do that in the past?
Alexander,
Well, I'm going to be a minority in this room and challenge quite a lot of probably assumptions here. I think actually, on the quick question about taxation incentives first, because we don't like taxation as much as possible. I think we can build a market. If anything, we should do tax cuts for building materials, installation to actually help people actually benefit from that. Mortgages, be able to have a financial system, we give mortgages to insulate your home and things like that to actually add on to a mortgage. That's going to be a better idea. On the short term, long term, the narrative question, I don't, maybe it's just me, I don't work in the business, but I don't see the narrative particularly as changing in an aggressive way. And I think some of the conversation, even today, is a bit too binary, right? Basically with us or you're against us. I think there needs a recognition. There's a lot of people out there, a lot of people who want to go to net zero. They understand climate change is a bad thing. They want to do their bit, but they also have concerns. They have concerns about the costs. And I'm not just talking about the financial costs, well, they're important, but the costs. I used the example earlier on about closing down your village, ripping out your boiler. So talking about, if your boiler breaks, then you're going to replace with a heat pump eventually. But it's not just sticking a box out of wall and putting a heat pump in. It involves completely redoing your radiators. It's a big job. And it's these sorts of concerns that people have that I think the Prime Minister was trying to speak to in his announcement, to actually say, we understand that there are concerns, we're going to work with you to overlay them. Because if we're seen, as someone who's passionate for net zero, that if we're seen as imposing top-down decisions, like we know best, we are the experts, we're telling you what to do, and come what may, we're going to run through, we're not going to bring people with us. And that is why we need to keep the person at the heart of net zero. Because fundamentally, why are we doing net zero? Why do we want to tackle climate change? Because we're doing it for people. We're doing it for a better planet. The only reason I care about the planet is it's a better place for me, my children, my grandchildren to live. And I want to put the people at the heart of that. That is why the planet is so important. It's our home. And we need to put the people back in the transition. I think sometimes too much of the conversation from Nick Timothy as well is actually regardless of what the concerns are and the needs of people. And we need to keep talking to people, explain to them it's going to be okay. We understand it, we're listening to you. Even if, frankly, we believe that we are right, the right solution, we still need to give you that time of day to have that concern, to have that conversation. And too much of the discussion is too binary. I think there's a lot more grey areas, not when it comes to getting net zero, but actually how you do it, how to mitigate some of those things that you can't put on a balance sheet, things that you can't put on a, how much carbon's emitted or how much that's going to cost you. Actually, people's gut feeling, you need to bring people with us. And that is something I think is lacking in debate. And I hope that what the Prime Minister said was appealing to those sort of people rather than upsetting the industry, which I want to be.
Steve, I'll come to, sorry, do you mind if I just come to you in a second?
Sure.
I don't want to keep going backwards and forwards like a tennis match between the two of you, but you do seem to be representing slightly different views within the party on the point. But where do you substantively disagree and where do you substantively disagree? I mean, because I don't think Chris has been saying that we shouldn't forget the past, right? And where is the common ground between you?
I think there's a lot of ground.
Actually, I forgot to mention, I think personally the party's involved in a form of green hushing. Well, green hushing is where companies still get on with their net zero commitments. I attended a launch of Institute of Advanced Automotive Propulsion in my constituency. Treasury Minister John Benn came to speak. He gave a speech, and this was a week after the Prime Minister's announcements, and they very proudly sort of said, net zero is the economic opportunity of our generation. It potentially can generate, £1 trillion worth of inward investment, potentially 480,000 new jobs, all quoting the net zero review statistics. So actually, I think, departments are still very much committed to this, which obviously makes it, odder that we've had the tone that we've had. But there is a lot of agreement, and to Catherine's point around common grounds, there is more that unites us than divides us on this issue. I think it is just a question Or, actually, when it comes to policy, we're in common agreement. It's just making sure that we don't lose that business investment by, sending the wrong messaging and signals that, a lot of people in the audience seem to be suggesting might have happened.
And that's why anything in policy is a tightrope. We all want the same thing as we said, with the active policy and changing materially, or it's just trying to bring people with us. But of course, there's that trade-off with business as well. And clearly from this room, we think the trade-off has gone on the wrong side. I think it's maybe gone on the slightly right side, but is that trade-off trying to bring the public and the business with us? Because frankly, I feel busy. We can say we can put far more stringent numbers in, data in, targets in, and say this is going to happen come hell or high water, but they won't be in the public with us. Equally, we'll just say leave it down to the public, and none of you guys will do anything. So it's trying to find that balance to get to where we all want to do, which we do want to do. And one thing I think is important noting in Parliament, apart from maybe a few colleagues on the net zero scrutiny committee, 99% of say of parliamentarians on all sides of the House want the same thing.
Yeah, 9 people voted against the energy bill.
Yeah,
9 people.
Yeah, I mean that's why there's really no disagreement. It's just really disagreement of maybe tone or slight maybe a date, but nothing major. And that's what we should try to get across to you guys, business. Say actually, it's coming. We want this. We're supportive of this. It's just we need to just work it out.
I would probably say the same, incentivize people, nudge them, and then the enduring mechanism should be taxes. That's what I would probably say, get people across the line first. I do think there's a lot of work in response to Miranda's and Jonathan's, a lot of work on the narrative that needs to be done. When we all talk about hydrogen and the molecules and the storage and the transport, actually people are only interested in, can they heat their home? Is it controllable? Is it affordable? Is it got emissions? That sort of thing. And I think I would put a lot of work in the narrative of what we're talking about around net zero, because we all talk a little bit in a bubble about net zero and what does it really mean when people talk net zero by 2050? What actually does it mean physically to people's existence? And I think we should work on that. And that's something we're trying to do on the hydrogen delivery councils, to try and create the narrative around that.
Can I just make a joke? I was just reminded by the conversation when I was a teenager with my mother, and getting very frustrated with my father. She said, "Look, don't worry about what he says, it's what he does that matters." And that, I think, is the answer to this conundrum, is that it's, whatever the tone is, and tone from the top is very important. You're measured by what you do. And the problem is we haven't done anything. Yeah. so that would be my only observation to that debate.
I think we probably have time for probably one last round of questions. Lady on the back row with glasses, a gentleman on the back row with beard, and a man on the front row with glasses. Please.
Sarah Beament, I'm head of energy transition investment banking. And I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the go faster point you made earlier. And really sound perhaps a note of alarm about what I've seen with some of the business case for the IRA in the US. So I spoke to a hydrogen developer a couple of months ago whose plan is to build hydrogen. And when I asked what the use for that was, they said they didn't need a use because the subsidy was so generous they intended to flare it and so they can set it on fire. And similarly, working for other, clients in the US who have just made over $1 billion on the back of subsidies that have come out of the IRA. So not to say that we don't need incentive mechanisms, but when you look at it and it looks like there's a lot of development going on in the US, none of that is actually going anywhere. It's all just an exercise in, or not any of it, but a lot of it is not being used in a green or productive manner. But then when I speak to investors in the UK, their main issue is on grid and it's on planning, and all of that sits firmly within sort of government supply side reform. And it isn't something that I, as a banker, can do anything about. So really the question is, what are we doing as the UK to really move forward those issues rather than focusing too much on the finance, which in the private sector, I think can kind of help solve.
Okay, thanks. I might disagree with you on the IRA comment. We can talk afterwards. Gentleman on the left. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Henry Chan from Friends of the Earth. As a kind of eco fanatic, I've gone ahead and done, I've got a heat pump, I've set up my own house to be net zero and disconnect from the gas grid and stuff. And it was easy, at least physically, they come and they do it in 48 hours. You have one night without heating and they go away and you have this brilliant system that keeps your house warm all day. But the thing, you talk about damaging and stressful thing, getting the grant for it through the Green Homes grant was, well, it was 2.5 years ago. I'm getting over it now. So how do we come up with these incentive schemes that will actually that are doable, so that actually, if your boiler breaks down, it might make sense to go and get a heat pump for it, because you're not going to have to wait, say, 3 or 4 months to get a grant through. You know, how do we do, and so that SMEs that might want to get into the business don't have to make their staff redundant, because it turns out that everyone's, for instance, stopped ordering systems while they wait for the next incentive to come up.
Great question, and then last one, and then.
Yeah, thanks. Professor Phil Taylor, University of Bristol, and independent member of the government's Net Zero Innovation Board. My question is about the regulator, Ofgem, and about regulation. And I'd like to hear how we can fix it. I know Catherine said something encouraging about them, but as far as I can see, they've been blocking the network companies from making strategic investment ahead of need for many years now, and they continue to do so in the last price control reviews. That's led us to 300 gigawatts of generation in the queue, with 10 to 15 years waiting time to get connected, putting net zero at risk. They are actively telling the gas companies not to plan for and ask for investment in hydrogen transition. They've changed the regulatory period from 8 years to 5 years. They continue to regulate gas and electricity markets separately and 2 or 3 years apart, which blocks whole systems planning and investment in the energy sector. So I see them as a huge blocker. How can we fix that, please?
Really good questions, Chris. You might have to leave.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, what this government has now taken forward this year, that, you know, ever since the net zero review, you know, has been positive. And you know, I'm still convinced that, you know, there have been changes that are going to help deliver the transition faster than the case of Europe. So a net zero duty on Ofgem through the energy bill, which was actually a recommendation that net zero review then the government wasn't going to do, but now they are going to do, has the potential, I think, to reframe the role of Ofgem to be able to put this on the map seriously and not work against net zero. Looking at the past the Green Homes grant and learning the lessons from that. I mean, you know, Alexander very much rightly said, you know, this will be trial and error. There will be pop-ups along the way, and that, you know, we have to learn from this. We've got to learn from the lessons around the Green Homes grant, and actually the boiler upgrade scheme, which obviously is now on £7,500 instead of £5,000. You know, a great sort of initiative, is now being guaranteed to 2028. So you would ideally, I'd like a 10-year scheme. Sort of, you know, a single scheme at the moment. I think there's 8 different forms of applying over the local authority or household to different schemes. And so, you know, simplifying it, lengthening the ability to apply is really important, and also learning, you know, from exciting other projects of best practice abroad. So I've mentioned obviously KfW, which pays for itself, you know, so we should have 0 interest rates and be able to finance that and then get the money back on some of the VAT measures that you are result of retrofit. But nevertheless, Ma Prime Renov in France, again, is open to everyone on a sliding scale of eligibility. What we have now is the great British boiler insulation scheme, you know, open up to council bands D, but there's a real opportunity to make sure everyone, because carbon dioxide, you know, it's right that we tackle energy efficiency in fuel poor households first, because there's a greater economic benefit in doing so. But we're going to have to decarbonise everyone. We're going to have to put insulation in every home, and so making sure everyone has that opportunity is really important. So simplicity is key here, and accessibility is key, because otherwise we're not going to have a just transition. So I think sort of, you know, it's important. I think the government have taken the right first steps by creating this Great British Insulation Scheme. They've done the right thing by extending the boiler upgrade scheme. It's now bringing it together, I think, into a mission-based approach as set out in the net zero review.
Great, thanks, Chris. Maybe Steve, go to you now.
Okay, first, Sarah, I think, well, shocking to hear that we're flaring hydrogen, which is the biggest waste you can imagine. I think adoption of the Windsor Review, full adoption of all the recommendations will be a big step in the right direction. I hope in the chances of a mistake that will be part of it, but let's wait and see, because I think that will reduce the grid connections. Henry, I think, simplicity, I think, is sort of like somebody needs to get involved with it with an axe and cut down some of the trees that are actually making it more complex. And I think, Phil, I think your observation is very similar to mine. I think I would have said that the regulator seems obsessed with value for money, both all else. That's probably because that's what he's been to do. I think he's got indigestion at the moment because he's got so much going on. And I think there is some good moves on this anticipatory investment. it's a start, but I think we have to continue and simplify things.
I'm just going to touch really on this IRA stuff, because I think actually IRA actually is a worrying thing for the UK and the EU, not necessarily for what they're trying to achieve, but that's the first time I heard about hydrogen flaring. That's mad. That's absolutely mad. But clearly, the IRA is sucking so much investment, knowledge, skills away from Europe, away from England, into America. And if it's not actually being used something productive, and speaking to various government ministers, we're almost like, well, there's no way we can compete with the IRA. We're not even going to have our own scheme like that because the money involved is so vast. What we need to do is find our own sort of way which doesn't try and batten it up. We're not going to do that. It's a completely different way of looking at it. And I guess the question is the American election next year, we talked about the UK election, what's going to have politicizing all this in the UK. Let's do politicizing this in America, which frankly is going to be a far bigger effect. I mean, all the support shows it seems that Trump is the good bet to win the next election. What does that mean for IRA? What does that mean for what we're talking about? It makes what, frankly, the conversation we're having in the UK when we're talking about the global carbon small bit, doesn't it? We need to have a concern about how does IRA in America continue despite a potential Trump victory? And that to me is a far bigger worry than any stuff going on in the UK on a global scale.
Anything on the regulator?
I must say, from an MP perspective, the regulators are atrocious, but that's just, I have so many issues with the regulator, back and forth, complex, not actually on the side of the consumer. I need to start from scratch basically with the regulator. They're not fit for purpose, unfortunately, and they're on the select committee. We often have them come to each of us, and it's just woeful.
Apology. Catherine, over to you.
We talk a lot with regulators. I don't think I'll be as judgmental as that. I think on the off-gen question, it's only recently sort of. I think a lot of what you've identified has already been identified. So the net zero mandate is going to change. This obsession with consumer and making sure the consumer was the priority led to a lack of anticipatory thinking from the regulator, and therefore in turn the network operators. But I think that's beginning to change in some of the conversations we're having. We've seen a change in GEM's chair and leadership. So I think it's coming, but that kind of pressure that you've articulated won't do any harm in terms of accelerating that forward-looking requirement. On IRA, so first half of my career I worked at BlackRock, and I used to be in natural resources equities, so often investing in emerging markets, developed world. And my response to your question is fiscal regime. You look for certainty. You don't look for the person that gives you the biggest carrot, because you know that's the first one that's going to get taken away. What you look for is certainty, and you look for political will, and you look for the idea that if you need at least 10 years to get your return, do you have confidence that you're going to be able to deliver a 10-year return? For mining assets, you're looking at paybacks of at least 7 years, and you need at least 15 years to capture 2 cycles. So I think that logic will apply wherever. And so the UK's job is to come up with whatever system structure, incentives, taxes, ultimately a package. And this is why it goes back to all of these things being coordinated, that says if you're outside looking in, you've got confidence, you've got at least 10 years in order to generate a return and capture the cycle. So that's my view on IRA. And then make incentives easy. Yeah, I have had similar experiences with you. A decade ago, we went into the biomass boiler space to get off grid. It's so painful. But so yeah, I hope someone else can work that out.
All right, I'm going to wrap up the discussion, and there'll be opportunity in a minute for any closing thoughts from the 4 panelists. It's been a great discussion with everyone. Thank you so much for everyone who's contributed. I think we kind of covered off both sides of that really well, that kind of policy and politics tone question, which obviously is really relevant. Which side shall I start at? Steve, do you have any closing remarks?
Just I'm quite surprised how light everybody is.
Oh, good to see you.
Yes, agreed. Everyone just wants the same thing. It's just slightly different tone, and what we want is the politician's job is to both bring the investor community with us, but also the public, and we need to bring both cohorts with us.
So I mean, I think I did about sort of 12 or 14 events. I had about 35 invitations, all specifically to focus on net zero. I think what's striking is that, this conference, and there's another net zero event I thought when we went into the wrong event earlier on, is that this wasn't the case a year ago. And that there's definitely been a touch paper that's been lit. And I think,
maybe the reaction to government's announcements, or even the fact that the Prime Minister decided to focus on it as an issue at the conference demonstrates, that sort of net zero, has been awoken now in public consciousness. We are in this global international net zero race, but also that net zero is here to stay. And it's understanding that, where can we find that common ground and how to progress the UK's position globally that is so important for the future UK economy. There is no future economy without a green economy.
What I've taken away from this conversation is that it actually does feel very much like business, which is there are three things in theory to run a business. You need a strategy, you need good culture, and you need to execute. And so when you think about how we can do energy transition, we need a master plan. And at the moment, it's all a bit busy, so we need to bring it together. We need culture, so tone from the top matters. And that's one of the things you learn in business is you've got to lead, you have to set the tone. So tone from the top creates the culture in order to get things done. And the third one is you just get on and do it.
That's a great point to leave us on. And if it just falls for me to thank Siemens Energy for supporting today's event. Thank you to our great panel and thank you to you, Bill. Thanks. Sir.